Well, hello everybody, this is Tim Green with Rattle Magazine. Welcome to your critique of the week. It's Friday, December 19th. Thanks so much for joining me. We're having a special, if you didn't notice the little banner that was up earlier, we're having a special look at the Rattle Chapbook Prize this time, a Q&A. It is, there are a lot more questions about chapbooks than there are for other forms of submissions, even the Rattle Poetry Prize. So it's always good to sit back and let your questions be answered. Talk about what chapbooks are, how great the prize actually is too. Now, if you're not familiar with the Rattle Chapbook Prize, it's one of the best book prizes in all of poetry. If not even though it's just chapbooks, which are shorter forms. But 3 winners every year receive $5,000 each. Full distribution to our over 10,000 subscribers. You get a lot of readers reading your work, which is what we all want to do as poets. And so the Rattle Chapbook Prize is great. You also get 500 author copies, which is way more than you can probably use. It takes a long time to get through 500 copies. When my book came out with Red Hen Press in 2008, I got 500 copies actually was the number, and it took about, 5 years to get through them all or something like that. But anyway, that is the Rattle Chapbook Prize, and we've been doing it for a very long time. I think this is what year is it? Let me pull up the website because I don't even know. It is, let's see, the year for the Rattle Chapbook Prize. It started in 2016, so this would be our 10th year, actually. Or coming up on our 11th year. We've done 10 years so far. So that's the Rattle Chapbook Prize. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat windows throughout the show. I'll be able to answer for anybody who has any more questions. Now, first of all, what a chapbook is a good question. And what's the difference between a chapbook and a regular book of poetry? Or a book of any other kind of book. And so here is a sample chapbook. I'll put this up on the screen really quickly. Oops, that's not the one. This one. This is one of my favorite covers. This is Visiting Her in Queens is more enlightening than a month in a monastery in Tibet. That's poems by Michael Mark. He was the winner in 2022, I believe, or one of the 3 winners that year. This photo. So you can ask about covers too. One of the things that people might be asking is if you should include cover art or make your cover. Nope, you don't have to. All you do is send poems. We make the cover art for you. This is one. This is actually a photograph that Michael took of his mother in her apartment in Queens on her camera roll, and we took that. We also took there's Michael Mark too. That's what we use as an author photo there after the space being empty later. It's really touching. I think this is my favorite cover. Because of how personal it is to both to Michael Mark and how just moving the covers itself, having his mother there at the table, and then later on the back, the table being gone, and a great title too for this chapbook. But what we do is we work on the artwork. We find art we both can agree on. If the artist or the poet has some friend who's an artist, Haunt Me, which is our most second to last chapbook here, a friend of Jose Enrique Medina. He wanted to use a piece of his, or he made it just for this cover, actually. This is the cover of Haunt Me. So we'll work with the artist, but you don't have to do that when you submit. Now, what is the chapbook? And I can just show you, if you see here, there are staples. Maybe it's easier to see on the full screen view. See how thin it is? And there's staples there, as opposed to like a regular full-size, what's known as a full-length book. If you can see that, this is the end still. It's squared edge there. It's called perfect bound. And the standard in the industry, let me see it easier on this screen too. The standard in the industry is to perfect bound books for the machine, they have to be at least 48 pages. Okay? So here's so this is the issue of Rattle. Again, we'll just look at this. And now it's got this squared edge at the top. And what they actually do, you can see in there, if we get a good look, every how books are printed, and you can't quite see. Maybe this camera you can see. I don't know. The focus is rough. But they'll take 8 pieces of paper that are longer, fold them in half, and that makes a sort of a chapbook itself. And then what perfect binding does, and they'll put those together. So that makes 32 pages because 8 times 4 is 32. If you fold a paper in half, you end up with 4 pages for each actual sheet of paper. And they'll take 8 of those, fold them in half. So every 32 pages is called a signature. And then they'll just add those signatures together, like stacking chapbooks on top of each other, almost just like this, just stacking it on top of each other. And then the difference is they'll trim this here, and they'll trim here too, and then glue this. So glue this right here, and that becomes a regular book. But when the book's not long enough, there's a lot of different ways to bind it, but this is called saddle stitching, where you just staple the papers together. And so you have that, and that's what a chapbook is. And chapbooks are just wonderful. I think for poetry, it's just a great length to be reading books. The number of poems, like maybe 15 to 20 or whatever that are in chapbook, it's a great length to sit down and look at one topic. And chapbooks have always been something I've loved. And so we started the Rattle Chapbook Prize in 2016 to put forth and give a better home to chapbooks, because there really aren't a lot of places where you get distribution on a chapbook. And one of the things about that perfect binding that we saw earlier, you have enough room in a spine so you can put words on the spine, which is a requirement for bookstores. And so chapbooks generally aren't available in bookstores. They're only available directly through publishers or through the poets. And that's one of the things that is sort of a ding on having them published that way. That's why small pressures usually don't do chapbooks, because they can't be distributed in bookstores because they couldn't be on a shelf like that. But it's such a great form. And so we wanted to put that forward and appreciate poetry at that length. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. I'm already some questions rolling in, and I'll sort of talk about stuff as we go, but we'll answer questions as we go too. Now, Cindy Gore asked too, what are your thoughts on the order of the poems in the manuscript? And a question from CB99 Videos, that's Carla Schwartz. Do you expect the traffic to be the topic, I think she means, or the traffic? Anyway, on just one topic. The traffic. Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that, actually, Carla, but yeah. So let's look at, I wanted to show you what a manuscript looks like when it's submitted. We already mentioned you don't have to submit cover art when you submit your work. And let's take a look at an actual submission. We looked at first, Visitor here in Queens is more enlightening than a month in a monastery in Tibet. That was the final version of Michael Mark's book. Let's take a look at his actual submission. It's still here in submittable for me. And this was it. So you see this, the file type is there at the top because that's how submittable goes. But it's just this title, which is a great title. It's almost a haiku. I love the title first off, but that's just the first page. As you're reading submissions in submittable, the document pops up in a preview mode and you see the title page. And the title is just that, nothing else on the page. And then some people include a table of contents. Michael Mark didn't. He just jumped in with the first poem, Estelle. And when you're reading submissions, you open this up and you start reading and you get hooked into certain books. And every year there's, how we read, I should explain this too. Megan O'Reilly, who's been a longtime editor at Rattle, she's been our primary reader for many years, for about 15 years. She's done a lot of the reading. And she goes through and reads everything first, pulls out the stuff that sort of has merit, it's a possibility. Usually we'll get several thousand Chapbook Prize submissions, and then several hundred will be that she pulls out as possibilities. I'll read those, narrow them down even further. We'll print out the top 100 or so books. Then Katie will join in. She'll start reading those books too. We'll all have our favorites. Then we take the top, 25 or 30 to Alan. He'll read all those books at an editorial meeting. We'll discuss it. We'll argue about it. And eventually we pick 3 winners. And really the difficult thing is always picking that third winner, because it's sort of, there's always like books you love most, but then there's that bubble, as Katie knows very well from her days in the poker, the bubble is very important. And that bubble between your third favorite and fourth favorite, a really big difference between publishing the book and not. So that takes a lot of thought and a lot of effort goes into deciding which book to pick at that point. Yeah. So anyway, but that's how the reading goes. And all a chapbook, all you have to submit is what Michael Mark did here, which is a title and then poems. And if you look at the actual, because nothing changed from as far as each poem goes. I think there's some editing that we do, of course, as publishers going through the book. But if you look at the table of contents, in Michael's book. Here's the table of contents page coming up. It's just these poems. There was no table of contents when he submitted. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24 poems that Michael included in this manuscript with a title. And that's all you have to do, is just make one document with the poems in a place that we can read them. And that's all Michael did. It's just these poems. And yeah, he just goes through that way. Now, other poets, and let me look at another one here. So this is the last winner. I'll put this on the screen too. This is Backlit by Liz Dobbins, our most recent winner. And this just came out and was published with our winter issue right here, Backlit. And very similar to Jose Enrique Medina, Liz Robbins wanted to use a friend of hers who was a painter to do this painting. And so she made this painting, and then I added the text and sort of made it all fit in the way that that we like. And but anyway, her submission, I think she took it a little bit more, put a little more work in the layout of the manuscript, right? Because where it is here. So she has Backlit as the title on her first page. And then she did do a table of contents. So, I mean, that's helpful. It's really just not necessary, but, it's there. That's nice. And then she did I believe she also did an acknowledgement. So I'm grateful to the sex workers I interviewed and whose stories I researched in this form to inform this chapbook. The names and likenesses to actual individuals have been changed. That's a good thing to know. And then she listed the places that that these poems in this book have been published. This is important only because we come across poems sometimes that we love, even though the whole book doesn't hold up to that. And maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about how to get your poems together in a way that works. But a lot of times it's like a few poems are great, and then it feels like a lot of the other poems are filler. And sometimes there'll be a great poem that we love, and but we know it's not going to win, but then we want to just publish that in an issue of Rattle. And so it's really nice to be able to say, oh, I love this poem. Say I love this game as a rip. I can look up here in the acknowledgments and say, is that poem still available? Oh, it was already taken by Moon City Review. Oh, well, and move on. So that's why it's nice to include that. We do publish poems from this that are just submitted as chapbook entries pretty regularly. As far as the formatting goes, you see this is just a regular sheet of paper. I think, let's see, Liz Robbins submitted as a PDF. Word documents are slightly preferred. It's just easier to deal with them when you're printing them out. And Michael's was a Word document. Regular size, it's just a 8.5 by 11 sheet, but it doesn't really matter. You don't have to format it at all. All you have to do is include the poems. And you think about what 1 to 2 dozen poems fit together, create a kind of experience, and just put them in order in a file. Send that in as the submission. That's all you have to do. We'll take care of the formatting for you if it's the winner. So it doesn't matter. If you're submitting for a fiction book or a nonfiction book or something, there's a standard where a standard manuscript style, which is like 12-point font. The thing should be double spaced, and that allows people to estimate how long it's going to be in a regular book. But there's really no standard here. Use some kind of font that's like a readable size. You want to use a consistent font throughout the book, obviously. But otherwise, the formatting just doesn't matter. We just want to see the poems. Don't include your name anywhere, though. You didn't see Michael Mark's name anywhere in here, or Liz Robbins, because this is judged anonymized. We don't want to know who the poets are. And so definitely do not include your name. If we know who the poets are, then it can't win. Let's see. Looking at the questions over here. Oops, sorry. Let's see. Kimberly Gibson Tran says, if poems get selected by magazines while the chapbook is still under consideration by Rattle, do we need to notify you via submittable? Yeah, it's sort of a courtesy, and that's the same with all poems just submitted. We want us to know. If you don't let us know, you kind of risk wasting our time a little bit because we might like that poem a lot and want to publish it. And then when we reach out and say, hey, we'd love to publish this one, you say, oh, no, it was already published somewhere else. And then we say, shucks. And you did waste some time. So it's helpful if you do let us know so that doesn't happen. Do that with the chapbooks the normal way you would. With any submission, just leave a note. If you log into Submittable, if you click on the submission, there's a field that sends a message, which is through the submission itself. It'll show up in our little message column when we go to do more stuff with you, and we'll know not to put that things in. Another poet says, wow, that's so helpful, not having to paginate or include a table of contents. Yeah, it doesn't really matter. We're reading poems, and we basically read the poems for being interested in and have if the poems are memorable, and we keep reading until they're not, and if the poem, we print it out. If we still want to keep reading it after we've already read it once, then it keeps going up higher and higher rounds, but all we do is read poems. Lisa Seidenberg says, can you include cover art or photo with the title page or photos in the chapbook? Yes, you can. There are some factors, though. First of all, color is much more expensive to print in. So if you had photos that needed to be color to work, that would be a sort of a editorial decision we would have to make. It's significantly more money. So the chapbooks cost probably $9,000 to print this many out, roughly. And it would go up to like $12,000. So it's like maybe $2,000 or $3,000 to print one of those signatures. Remember, a signature is 32 pages. That's on an offset printer. So if you do one page in color, all 32 have to be colorable in that entire signature. And so you have to pay for that, even if it's just one color picture. So that's something we would consider. I mean, I'd be less likely to publish a poem that relies on color in Rattle itself or a chapbook that needs color inside. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But we have had color in our issues. Sometimes it's worth it. Other times we've converted things to black and white because it doesn't really matter that much. It just depends. But it is, if the color is necessary, it might be one of those things that lets us... That makes us pick something else, actually. It's sort of a point against it if it's got to have color. Also, the other thing to think about is with photos or any kind of art, we have to know we can get the rights too. So if you're using something that's not in the public domain, something that's a friend of yours or your own art, make sure you note that so we know too that it's not a risk that we will accept this as the winner and then not... sorry, I'm reading things and lost my train of thought. But anyway, I think you get the idea what I'm saying. Yeah, what I was saying. Okay, so if we have to know that we're going to be able to get the rights, because if there's a book that makes it seem like we're not going to be able to get the rights to the art, but you need the art for the poems, that's obviously not a book that's going to work. Like if you're using a modern famous artist's paintings as ekphrastic poems, and that artist is probably going to ask us for like $50,000 to make the book, we're not going to be able to publish that book. So that's something that we have to consider too. To ask, Lisa Seidenberg says, can you, what about color cover? Yeah, the cover's always color for us. It doesn't matter, but you don't need to submit that. We worry about art later. We're only reading the poems right away. Jan Therongan asks, why are so many copies given to the winner? Isn't it excessive? Well, the thing is with printing on an offset printer, a main cost is setting it up. And so the paper stock and stuff like that is not that much more. So the difference between publishing, printing the 12,000 that we have to and 12,500 is kind of negligible. But reprinting after the fact to reset all that up is actually really expensive. And so we print out as many as we think you might be able to use because that's cheaper than trying to do a second run if you ever run out or if we run out and want more. So we try to print as many as we might need because that's just better economically. And so 500, it's a lot. But, they're thin books. I think it's about 100 copies per box. You end up getting about 5 boxes in the mail. You can put that in your attic or garage, and you'll be thankful in a few years when you start running out. Now, Cindy Gore said, please tell us why a winning manuscript stood out the first time you read it. Thanks. Let's look at one of the last winners. Let's go back to the backlit because we have that up. So this is what we see when we open up Submittable. We see the title, backlit. The first thing, I think that's an intriguing title. It makes me curious what it's about, and it sort of makes for memorable copy too. So I like the title. That's the first thing I think. And we kind of just scrolled it past here. That doesn't really matter. The dedication for the powerless, which you'll see is in the book itself too. And then the first poem, this game is a rip. The city I come from was split into parts by a river, its tributaries. Everyone knew goodness, gauged how deep its well in everyone else. A black dog rover stalked the night streets, lining the minds of housebound women, watery circles on tables where glasses of gin had been. Do you remember? All the things we always talk about in Critique of the Week are happening here. I don't know yet what this game is a rip means, but the title of the whole book means something. The title of this poem means something. It's pulling us in with a voice and images. And then the real key is that this voice and image and everything it was doing ended up being consistent throughout the book. One piece of advice that people will tell you, and I sort of hate it, but it's true, is that if you put your best poems toward the top, we're more likely to notice and pay attention to them. That's just a normal reading thing. If you're sort of slogging through poems when you get to a really good one, you're already a little bit tired and you're sort of persuaded to get ready to click the no button. If the best poem is right up at the top, then you get excited and you're sort of disappointed later, but it lasts longer. And so I think was it Billy Collins? It was somebody who suggested putting your best poems at the beginning. And that's probably something to do too. But you want to think about, that's going to make it go farther and to the next round maybe. But really the main thing is that we see poems that we want to read, want to keep reading, want to read again, and we don't get tired of them. And the whole thing does something as a whole. Like the sum is more than the total of its parts. And so, yeah. Okay, so Desi Cochran asked this, and we haven't talked about it yet, but it is one thing that makes the Rattle Chapbook Prize complicated and a little bit difficult is that Desi says, maybe I would ask, but if you recognize some of the poems from the submissions. Yeah, so this is a blind reviewed contest. Like all the stuff we do at Rattle tries to be, we go to varying lengths to make sure that's the case. And for a contest, it's really carefully done. And yeah, and so there is a rule that if we've published a poem, definitely do not include it in the chapbook. We'll know for sure that it's yours and who it was if it was a poem we published. Because the poems we publish, we see on social media, we put in the books, we see over and over again. There's no way we're not going to notice. It is a difficult sort of gray area. And this is an unfortunate thing about how much community we have at Rattle. Where, if people have, if the poems, I'm just reading what Katie says. So, if there are poems aren't strong, exclude them. Yeah, definitely, that's true. If we recognize the poems, we have to. It can't win, and that's unfortunate. But this is a blind judge contest. But it takes more than you think, which is the tricky part, for us to actually realize who the poems are, too. So if you're one of the people, and, there's this wonderful group of about, 30 people who submit poems to the prompt lines every week and do the prompt lines every month and do Poets Respond all the time, and we kind of get to know your voice. It is possible, especially I think Katie is the most dangerous one here. Because she does, when she's reading the prompt poems, the prompt line submissions, she's really looking at them closely. She's giving a lot of personal feedback. So she is more likely to recognize one. If Kate has given you like a personal response and probably is familiar with the poem, I would advise you not to include that poem. Because once your sort of cover is blown, you can't win, which is a big thing. So best advice is to sort of be careful with that, I guess. Hemet Malik says, what if a poem sounds like someone's? No, we have to be sure. Because one of the things that happens, it's really fascinating to me, especially with the Rattle Poetry Prize, this comes up a lot, where we have no idea who the winners are. We have this stack of like 11 winners. There's this really fun day where you go into the database, every poem just has a little number at the top. I type in the number, see who that actually was. And I think I know who the poet is so often. Like I have a hunch, but I'm not sure. And then so often that hunch is completely wrong. And it's not the poet we think it is. And even the gender, like I think, oh, this is definitely a woman writing this poem. And then no, it's not, or whatever. There's just, it's really harder to tell than you think, just by voice and by that kind of thing. So, yeah. Yeah, Jamie Thomas says, what a champagne problem to have that you've published so much in Rattle, you'd be recognized. Yeah. But so the thing is, it's really hard. The number of poems we see. Yeah. The number of poems that we see, it's hard to remember all the poems unless we publish them, really, or unless we gave sort of detailed feedback, which basically only Katie does. Yeah, Dick Westheimer says, so many of my poems have filtered through Rattle prompt lines. It's like a reverse game of Tetris to put together a blind chapbook. Yeah, it is something. And the other thing, too, we say if you've published any poems in Rattle, or there's any you're worried about blowing your cover, don't include those in the chapbook. Leave a gap, and then we can add those poems later, which I believe Michael Mark has one. A daily practice is in this book, but it wasn't in the submission. He just left it out and said, hey, now that you picked this as the winner, I would like to add this poem back. Is that good? And I said, yeah, I love a daily practice. So you can do that too. And as Jamie Thomas says, this is a champagne problem that not a lot of people probably have. But if you are worried that especially Katie will recognize your poem, don't submit those poems. And if you have a poem in Rattle, definitely don't include that in the chapbook. Besides, we sort of would prefer to have all new poems too. So there's that. Let's see. But talking more, so Katie mentioned, and I do want to point this out. So we already talked about like what goes into the poems that are the winner. And Katie said here, when in doubt, if you don't think the poem is strong, leave it out. We'd rather have a shorter chapbook that's really powerful and full of great poems than a chapbook that maxes out the 48-page length and it has filler in it. The filler type poems are, the filler type poems are more likely to make us not want to publish the book. Like we want the whole thing to be read straight through, and that's what we try to have every chapbook do. And I think we've managed to do that with all the chapbooks we've done. We've published about 30. And I think they're all wonderful reads all the way through with no filler, which is the point of chapbooks. You can make it any length you want around a topic. Now, Jeff Stumpa says, I'm not concerned about doing this myself, but it's worth asking what qualities in a manuscript are likely to be automatic disqualifications in content or construction. Yeah, I don't think there are any automatic disqualifications. I mean, the poems have to be evocative and memorable. And that's really all that matters. The topics we want a wide array of topics. We want to cover ground that we haven't before. We want a variety. We're really thrilled to have Kat Lehman's Book of Haiku in the spring last year. Really excited to have the Soft Black Stars, which is Matthew Buckley Smith's traditional forms book. They're all sonnets and villanelles and all sorts of forms there. We love that. Most of the chapbooks we published are free verse, but we like other stuff too and want more of it. We want light stuff. We want heavy stuff. We've covered lots of topics. We want stuff we haven't covered before in the exact way. And we make it new. Is that Ezra Pound admonition? We want things to feel new and feel fresh and feel unforgettable is the main thing. Let's see. Looking at some more questions. As far as ordering too, so one of the things, what you want to do, and you should enter the Chapbook Prize. I wish I could enter myself. I know Katie wishes she could enter herself too. it supports Rattle. It is a fundraiser. Our 2 contests that we do every year, we don't ask for donations. We are a nonprofit, but we have a great, huge number of subscribers, and a lot of those comes from the contest, and that's the way to help fund a magazine. So that's great. If you subscribe, you get a 1-year subscription or extension. You get 4 chapbooks and 4 issues of Rattle, all for $30. Totally worth doing. You totally should, even if, and it's the other thing is it's a great encouragement to put your poems together into a chapbook form, into a manuscript. Like, start thinking that way. And it's a real springboard into a full-length book too. But just looking at your poems and seeing how they fit together really helps. So what you want to do is, like, look at all your poems that you've written, set aside the ones that you think are good, that are publishable, that are done, and then read through and see, what themes, like what you have, how they relate to each other. So much of what we write is based on the kind of obsessions that we have, and the psychological turmoils, and the things that we find challenging, and the things that we are confronting about our lives. Topics that mean things to us or what we're writing about. And so they tend to have these threads that run through the poems you're writing no matter what. And so look for those threads, put the poems together that fit, and just anything between 12 to about 30 or 20, it depends how long the poems are, 12 to 24, something like that. Number of poems fits. So just put those together and submit them, because it's really worthwhile, just something to do. It's a way to subscribe to Rattle too. It's a way to support us, and putting your manuscripts together is really valuable for you as a poet. So it's something I highly recommend. There's a Dick Westheimer recommended. I'm trying to find it. I'm scrolling through all the comments. Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to find the one. So is Ordering the Storm? Was that the book Dick recommended? I'm not seeing it. There's just a lot of comments. But as far as ordering goes, what I think about, the best way to order books, in my opinion, is to think about the sort of emotional roller coaster that you're going through when you're presenting poems, and have it have a kind of arc, an emotional arc, like a novel would. Where there's a rising action, there are highlights, there's interludes that break it up a little bit. You want to be surprised every time you turn the page by your response to a poem, and that's the way to think about it. So make it so, if you have funnier poems, don't put them all together in one chunk, and then your sad poems all together in one chunk. Have it be this sort of tapestry, this symphony that you're playing as you move through the poems. So order them that way. Think about introducing the characters, the voice of who's speaking, things like that. And then how you want the emotional variety to move as a kind of progression. That's really the key to good books. If you look at I think the best book I read this year was our guest. Do I have it? Within reach. Richard Sykens, I Do Know Some Things. It's too far for me to reach. But that book it's a great example of playing with arc and setting things up, having sort of tangents in different directions, a rising sort of theme that sort of resolves by the end. And by the end, you get a kind of structure, even though it's not a narrative book like you would tell a nonfiction prose-like book or a novel. There's a lot of fragmentary movement, but there is this sort of sense of arc and variety to it. And I think that's the best way to order poems within a book. Let's see. Going back to find more comments. Our vid note says, can a variety of modes or tones work within a chapbook, or does the feel need to be unified along the theme? No, I think definitely. You can also even have sections. There's so many things you can do. One of the things I think it's worth talking about is the different ways. So people think of, and I think it's because I think publishing sort of leads people in this avenue. It's so much easier to market a book when you have something like Visiting Her in Queens is more enlightening than a monastery in Tibet. I know what it's about. I can have a description of that. I can present it to somebody and say, this is what this book's about. And so we tend to, as a publisher, favor, I think unfairly, books that have a sort of central theme And so especially as MFA culture rises and things get more professionalized, people aim for having more concise themes. But I don't think that's always the best way to go about it. And having a lot of variety is really good too. Having books that are just good poems. One of the things you can do that very few people have done, but you totally could, is have a greatest hits kind of book. You make your own like new and selected if you've published books before, and have your favorite poems run through a thread like that. A new and selected chapbook would be a fascinating way to introduce people to your other books. That's something that I always think people should take more advantage of that. There's one poet that did that, which was, I could pull it up. I think it was, and I think this is the only, what was it called? Yeah. I think this is the only winner that did this as far as I know. But if you look at here, this is Bag of Hands by Mather Schneider. And there's no table of contents here, but Bag of Hands was poems about his wife and her immigration and falling in love and things like that, all sort of tying up about their relationship that occurred over the course of like 3 books for him. He added like 2 or 3 new poems that hadn't been in books, but about 15 had. But they were pulled out from old books and told a new story or a new singular thread. And I think that works really well. And I think if people reading this chapbook, are more likely to go back and look at Mather's other books. So that's a great thing to do that people could do and haven't done very often. The other thing you can do is if you have a full-length manuscript that you're trying to work on and trying to put forth, you can excerpt some poems from that book. If you're submitting the full-length book contest, you can take your favorite 15 poems from your manuscript and send that to the Rattle Chapbook Prize. The very first winner, I have to scroll a while for that, but the very first winner, hang on, was Zaina Hashim Beck's Arabi song. And here, I'll pull, this is the very first, I'll just put it on screen like this. This is Arabi song there by Zaina Hashim Beck. And here. And this book, it was our very first chapbook, but very shortly after, and I can't remember the name of the title of the book offhand, but very shortly after the poems in this book, she ended up winning a first book prize somewhere else, and all these poems appeared like 6 months or a year later in her first full-length book too. And that's something you can totally do. It gets you on the radar of people. It's a huge thing to put in your bio. We don't have this like hierarchical system where we're like, oh, we treat you more seriously because you've won an award or whatever. But that's just the nature of humanity, and a lot of places can take you more seriously when you've won an award. So if you're trying to get your first book out, having trouble, finding a home and navigating that complicated way of you have to go about publishing poetry books these days, take your best 15, put it into a shorter version of the manuscript, and then try to publish this first. And not only, the prize money, if you win, will support all the other contest entry fees as you try to get the full length out too. So that's nice. CB99 Video says, I wasn't sure you were able to include poems that were published in a full-length manuscript in a chapbook later. Yeah, you can, as long as the press is okay with it. You have to make sure you have the rights. Sometimes you don't. But it depends, yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Steve Horrell says, so if a poem was already published in a book, you mean you can submit it to the chapbook? Yeah, as long as there's some new stuff. We don't want all old poems, The other thing is, the other complication is you have to have the rights still to your poems. So you have to actually look at your contract and what you can do. We're fine with doing that for the Chapbook Prize, like we did with Mather Schneider's, but only because his publisher, NYQ New York Quarterly, publishes other books. They didn't mind either, and their contract isn't it's writer friendly enough that it didn't get in the way of reprinting those poems. Sometimes though, if you sign a book contract, you don't actually have the rights to use your poems anywhere, and we would have to get permission from your original publishers. Let's see. Looking for some more questions. Yeah, I didn't really finish answering. So can a variety of modes or tones work within a chapbook, or does the feel need to be unified? So I think another thing you can do is have 3 different sections in a chapbook and make it in different parts, or 2 parts. Yeah. Katie also reminded you, of course, you remember you can also submit multiple times too. Not just saying this because it supports Rattle more, but also because the people here right now tend to be among the best submissions we receive. Yeah, and that's true. You don't have to limit yourself to one chapbook either. You can submit multiple times. You'll get multiple years on your subscription too. Let's see. Yeah. Katie points this out too. There's a pattern of getting a lot of submissions close to what won last year, but we want the variety alive and good in poetry today. And yeah, that's true. It's more prominent, I think, in the Rattle Poetry Prize for single poems. But I'm sure we're going to get a lot of formal poems now, because this year's Rattle Poetry Prize winner was An Ordinary Childhood by Maury Creech, which is a Meredithian sonnet. And personally, I'm happy to get more formal poetry, but there's this tendency to look at last year's winner and submit that. And what we really want is variety. And another thing that's interesting too, you can resubmit old chapbooks too that you have submitted in the past, especially if they've been revised a lot. It's a question I get all the time. There's one, it's actually really interesting. There's one chapbook, and I shouldn't say who it is, but the poet kept submitting and kept being really close every year. And I think that she submitted about 4 years in a row. And the 5th year, I think we were going to pick hers. And then that book ended up being, she withdrew it because it was published as a full-length book. But it tends to, as you work on manuscripts, you sit with them, the poems and the collection as a whole gets better and better and better. Especially if you're revising it, please don't hesitate to resubmit. And the other factor too is that we are looking for variety. So sometimes, if we had a manuscript that, we liked the poems, but it was so similar to a topic that we had last year, maybe 2 years later, that's not the case anymore. And it feels more variety. And we want to have balance among the 3 winners every year too. So that plays into it as well. There are a lot of factors that go into that. So, you can definitely submit, the same manuscripts again, especially if they've been updated a little bit. Let's see. Lisa Seidenberg says, how many chapbook submissions do you receive? It's about 3,000 last year. The first year it was about 800, and it's sort of slowly grown every year, and now it's about 3,000 we got. If you look at the announcement, I believe on the website, it says how many, the actual number, but I don't remember off the top of my head. Let's see. Terry Miller says, could you have a future interview with your initial reader editor? Well, that's a possibility. That's interesting. She's kind of shy. We try to get her on the show very often over the years and never got that to work, but maybe. Let's see. One thing, I know Carla Schwartz asked this last year, but we do consider self-publishing legitimate. So if you've published a chapbook yourself, then that's no longer eligible to submit to the Rattle Chapbook Prize. But it's sort of again, there's some these gray areas and everything. And if you self-published at Kinko's and handed out some copies, that's very different than having a book available with an ISBN on Amazon. If you've done that, it's definitely disqualified. If nobody's going to know and you just printed out some copies, that's not really the same thing, So it's kind of, don't be too afraid of that. But if it was for sale somewhere and you were really selling it, then we don't do that, even if it's a self-published chapbook in the past. Because self-publishing is a viable means of publication. Let's see. I'm still looking if there are any other questions. Yeah, I'm still talking about themes. Kimberly Gibson Trans says, Tim said, yes, they are considered without a theme, but I noticed that most that win are themed. That's one of those, not the chicken and egg, but like, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy too, because most of the chapbooks do have a theme. It's just what people send. Like I was saying before, there's a greater and greater tendency over the last 20 or 30 years since with the rise of poetry MFAs, really, that books are increasingly thematic, I think. And so I think we lean a lot in that direction by sort of example. And so most of the things that, let's see. Sorry, I'm just reading comments too. So it's just rare to have chapbooks submitted that are full of good poems that aren't already thematic, because that's just what people are trying to do usually. But it's not necessarily something you have to do. And we would definitely be happy to publish just great poems, Desi Cochran asked, anything you wish to see more this year? That answer is always kind of the same, because there's always stuff that we just wish we had more. You hear me talk about formal poetry. We do have one book, The Soft Black Stars, coming up in the spring. It's a wonderful chapbook by Matthew Buckley Smith that's all formal poems. We don't get enough formal poetry. We'd love more of that. We don't get enough things that are actually funny or light or, romantic. Like the more positive side of poetry, we're always short on that. And then, and just variety of topic too, like different perspectives. We're always looking for things that we've never read before. And so, we've never published a book about like poems about like the inner horse racing world. I think because T.R. Paulson talks about horses a lot in her poems, and she's not here, but she was here recently. And, things like that it's a niche. It's really cool to read about stuff. And, anything that you can teach things about, teach us about, teach our readers about is great. So we're always looking for that, always looking for things that are lighter, always looking for things that are more formal. Yep, funny, romantic, and form. And it's not because we love those things in particular. It's just because it's always on the lighter side of what we get. We don't get a lot of submissions that are like that. So we always want to have variety. And, Let's see. So Steve Horrell says, and I it's hard sometimes I don't articulate things very well in the live stream, but Steve says, this confuses me. You can take poems from a previously published book, but not a chapbook. No, sorry. So what I was talking about, if you publish the chapbook, say Michael Mark published on Amazon himself, visiting her in Queens is more enlightening than a month in a monastery in Tibet, and then he submitted that would be disqualified. But if he had some poems in a different book with a different theme and it felt different, it was structured different, but some of the poems came from that book, that's fine. That's our stance on that. So you can take some poems from an old chapbook or an old book. You just can't take the whole chapbook or book. One of the things we haven't mentioned is the rule about previously published. So one of the winners has to be someone who has not published a full-length book of poetry yet. And that's been the case since I think after the first year we added that rule, so that people would feel like we're not just publishing famous poets. We had Denise Duhamel last year. We've had some big name poets be the winners. A lot of people have books already, and we really want this to be a launch pad for people's careers. We want to make sure some people are using it as a launch pad to a great career with a first book. And so one of the winners, there's a box to check. If you've published a full-length book of poetry, then you have to check that box. Let's see. Just scrolling down some more. CB99 Video says, if you want to have your best poems in the chapbook, if one of the poems was submitted to the prompt lines in the past, but you think it's one of your best, you think you should exclude it. Probably. If you read it on the prompt lines, you submitted, Katie gave you feedback, you haven't revised it since, you probably shouldn't include it. But if you didn't read it on the prompt lines, you got a general reply, I think feel free. It's a difficult gray area, and I'm sorry that's the case. But to have the fairness of a anonymized contest while also having a great community, there's some kind of friction. That's the best way to handle that is difficult. Somebody said, let's see. Somebody said something about public domain. Kimberly Gibson Trans says, just use old paintings in the public domain. Yeah, anything in the public domain, you can totally use any way you want. So that's great. Mark Goodyear says, question, do you have rights to the art in the Ekphrastic Challenge? We don't, if you wanted to use that like as a cover. But again, don't worry about the covers. Or are you talking about making a chapbook out of Ekphrastic Challenge submissions? We could probably get the rights to that. But it might be difficult. It's one of those difficult things. Let's see. Carla Schwartz asks, what is your definition of full-length book published? Full-length book is a book more than 48 pages. That's sort of the dividing line. And again, it's because after 48 pages, you get to the perfect binding and it's in bookstores, or could be. Less than 48 pages is some kind of chapbook stitching. It can be threaded or stapled or anything sewn, but yeah. Let's see. Okay, so that might be, I think we're running out of questions. But we're really looking forward to seeing what everybody submits to the Ekphrastic Challenge. I mean, that's the Ekphrastic, I'm reading as I'm talking. Submits to the Rattle Chapbook Prize. It's really exciting. It's really fun. And I think it's the favorite. I say so many things are my favorite thing. But really, I love the chapbook length. It's so fun to read chapbooks. It's so fun to discover, like, in depth how good poetry is. There's always a couple dozen books we'd love to publish, and it's really fun to see that those exist and what you can explore through poetry. Let's see. Somebody said it was my life is right. How does picking covers art for the winning chapbook work? Well, I guess I haven't mentioned that. I mentioned this was Michael Mark's own photo. The backlit one was a friend. What we do is I ask the person if there's anything they want to use, first of all. If they have a friend who's an artist they want to use, or if they have something in mind. The poet will say, I was thinking about this artist. I wonder if you could get the rights to that. And I was like, okay. Or if, if like Michael Mark, it was just had a photograph and thought actually gave me a ton of photographs. He thought maybe using your apartment would be a good idea. And I went through, he sent me a whole Google Drive full of them, and I found these two. And then I did a lot of, I don't know how well you can see, there's a lot of photoshopping into that. Like the lighting is totally different, that there's a just sort of washed out kind of quality to it that sort of makes it feel older and more faint and ghost-like, maybe you could say. There are a lot of layers actually in that Photoshop file. But so I work with the art to make the best cover possible, pick the fonts and things. If the artist doesn't have any idea, what I do is go through and look for possibilities. I look at public domain art. I look at artists I think we could get to use, people who've submitted art for us before. I should have grabbed more chapbooks, but some of them, we have art submissions for cover art. A lot of times there's like really cool art pieces that it doesn't fit the Rattle cover because we try to have it fit like the season and the theme, or like what's going on in the issue of Rattle. But there's these like whole archive of stuff people have submitted that I like. It just didn't fit. And so I flip through those and see what might work out of that stuff. And then I present some samples of like, hey, what about this or this or this? Do you like any of these? And kind of the poet will guide me through what they like, what we don't. We try to just make everybody happy. I'm not going to publish any covers that I don't like. And I don't want to publish anything the poet doesn't like either. And so it's a process that usually goes on around a few months before publication. Let's see. Yeah. Dick Westheimer says, we'll be publishing the economics of the Rattle Poetry Prizes again. That was fascinating. Yeah, definitely, yeah. Yeah, maybe we should make a more dedicated page to that, like online, instead of just posting on social media. Okay. Well, I think that is, yeah. Steve Horrell says, I love the chapbook length. Yeah, me too. And Katie says, of course, please send all your best. Can't wait to read. Yeah, we are excited. It's fun. I love this contest every year. And I love what we get to put out. Really, the chapbooks are so good over the years. We've published, 30 plus, and I've loved them all. And I think they're all great reads. And looking forward to adding more to that series. Okay. So I guess that'll wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Glad you enjoyed the hour. If you have any more questions, you can always, of course, email me, tim@rattle.com. I try to reply to everybody, although my inbox is, of course, slammed, so follow up in a couple days if I don't. Yeah. Well, I hope you have a great week. Now, next week's guest on the Rattlecast, I should say, since this is technically a critique of the week, and we want to tell you what's going on. Next week's guest on the Rattlecast is going to be Manuel Iris. And so Manuel is a wonderful bilingual poet, great friends with Dick Westheimer, as I understand it, poet laureate of Cincinnati, or former poet laureate of Cincinnati, Ohio. His newest book is The Whole Earth is a Garden of Monsters. He's got another book, too, that we're going to be digging into a little bit that's forthcoming, I believe. But he's a really wonderful promoter of poetry. The spirit of poetry is so alive. He's a great host of poetry events. He hosted a reading for me and Katie, and just was such a great, one of the great sort of MCs around, too. Really fun. It's going to be great fun talking to him. That's Manuel Iris. The prompt for this week, I should say, too, was to, and this is a harder prompt maybe, think about the biggest improvement you've made as a poet in this year and write a poem that showcases your skill. So how have you improved? Is there a way you've thought about poetry a little differently? Maybe since watching Critique of the Week, or just maybe picking up from some of the guests on the Rattlecast, so the way they approach it. Like maybe, for example, I always disliked sestinas, but the idea of having each stanza in a sestina be its standalone kind of thing, like a guzzle, makes the sestina seem a lot more fun. That was from Aaron Murphy. And maybe doing sestinas like that, something important. Maybe having more of a welcome mat. That the Katie likes to bring up Billy Collins using the eye chart, where you start with a big E, something that you can really understand, and then go into finer and finer detail as you go through a poem. But being welcomed first by that sort of clarity at the very beginning. That's the thing to think about. Anything you've picked up this year that you like to use and you think has made your poetry better, highlight that in a poem and then submit that for the prop lines this week. Anyway, that's going to be all for now. We'll see you. Hope you have a great weekend. Hope you have a great Christmas holiday too, or whatever you celebrate. The solstice is coming up soon. Anyway, we'll see you then on Monday night for Manuel Iris, Rattlecast number 323, the regular time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. No Critique of the Week next week, I should say, and no Rattlecast that next week, the 29th of December. We're going to take that week off, so enjoy it while you got it. Coming up this Monday with Manuel Iris. We'll be there. Have a great weekend. We'll see you later. Goodbye.